I do, I thought about that first half as I was watching it because like I watched the first half on the train up to Leipzig and then, joined you for the last 20, 30 minutes at the Champions Pub in Leipzig. Um, and I was it was almost kind of like a reverse of what we've seen in the first leg, Stefan, where Dortmund were so excellent in the first half against Lille and then terrible in the second half. And at one point, and it was a former Dortmund player, Meunier, who got them back into this match, right? With first he gets a yellow card, then he causes a penalty. Emre Can scores, and from then on, you kind of had this feeling that Dortmund kind of just hit it off. What I mean, we see this all the time right now with the Dortmund team. They're Jekyll and Hyde, aren't they?
Yeah, you're right, actually. It's an interesting comparison to the first leg because the first leg, Adeyemi scores first. Dortmund look really good in the first half, and then they drop off in the second half. And in this game, it was the opposite. You could actually almost argue if like you look at the two legs as like four quarters, Dortmund were better in the first quarter, the fourth quarter, which I guess seemed to be the only ones that mattered in the end. As Dan said, Lille aren't a great team. They're a decent side. Dortmund were very lucky with a draw. But I think once Dortmund kind of got going in both games, you really kind of saw that they were capable of getting behind Lille. They're not a team full of great players. Not that Dortmund are either, I suppose, but they did seem to get going. I mean, I think the big difference tonight, and I don't want to keep kind of flogging this dead horse, or keep going on about it in every episode, but I think honestly feel like the big difference tonight was Maximilian Beier on the left wing, and we talked specifically about this position after the game of the weekend, in terms of how Gittens doesn't have that same link-up play. But I think there's two things that Maximilian Beier has that has really kind of allowed him to kind of grow into his role on that left side. It's his work rate and his link-up play. He's obviously a great striker. He showed that tonight with his goal, but I think just fundamentally, he's just an easier player to slot into a system and say, right, can you just play off Girassi? Can you play off Rierson? Just keep the ball. Can you just, don't take on two or three defenders and lose the ball? Because, as we talked about after that Lille game and the game of the weekend there against Augsburg, if you've got someone like Gittens on that left wing and he's constantly giving away the ball, it means the ball's constantly being turned over and Dortmund aren't able to control the match. And I just think Bayer's just obviously and to be fair, Beier is further ahead in his development. He's obviously had a couple of seasons at Hoffenheim, whereas Gittens is obviously still learning his trade at Dortmund. So he's still got plenty of time. It's not really a slight on Gittens per se. It's just that Beier is the more experienced player at this point in his career. He knows what he's doing. He knows how to lead the line. At Hoffenheim, he was that talisman. He was the guy who had to get them up the pitch when they weren't the best team on in most games. And I just think he's a far more useful kind of player in these games. And I think it meant that Dortmund were able to kind of slowly but surely take control of this game, whereas had it been someone like Gittens in there, and we saw this with Adeyemi as well, to be fair, I did think this was his best game, but he was constantly giving the ball away. He was constantly trying to do quick 1-2s, counter-attacks. Everything was rushed. Same with Brand, who I thought was, completely anonymous again. But they still had Girassi, they still had Beier, and it meant that Dortmund were able to kind of really grow into this game, I thought. And yeah, that was the kind of main takeaway I took from it, to be perfectly honest with you. We talked about after the Augsburg game, it was bizarre that Brandt and Gittens had been brought back in against Augsburg and they didn't work. I said on Blue Sky before the match, I'm not surprised at all that Gittens was then dropped for this game. I was surprised that Brandt was kept in, to be honest with you, because again, I didn't really think he was great in this match. I'm kind of now getting to this point where I'd rather just see Kovac just kind of persevere with someone like Kearney Chukwuemeka or Gio Reyna, or even push Pascal Gross further up, because he's obviously done a decent-ish job in that role as a kind of a more advanced playmaker. But yeah, I thought Beier was the standout player in this game, and he ultimately obviously eventually scored what happened to be the winning goal, and I thought he deserved it because he's been growing into that role with every passing week at Dortmund, and he's now ending this season as probably one of the most supported players.
No, he does. What do you think, Dan, about all of what Stefan said there?
It seemed an odd decision that you had Beier starting twice, and that was the best that Dortmund had looked since Kovac took over, and then he was back on the bench. and then they were struggling again. And I think Gittens is a great player. I think there were games in the first half of the season where I think, Şahin probably would have been out of Dortmund earlier if it wasn't for some of the kind of solo heroics that Gittens had. There was some goals that he scored which just were not the goal he scored against Bayern, the opening half of the season game against Frankfurt, where it was just these goals that came out of nowhere, and the end narrative was like, "Oh, Dortmund did very well," but in reality, there were goals that just kind of came out of nowhere, and that's what Gittens can do. But I think that link-up play seems to be lacking, and when you look compared to what Beier's done, I don't have the statistics in front of me. I'm not sure how often he started in the first half of the season under Nuri Şahin, but he didn't in this wide position. He came in on this with this reputation that he's a second striker. He'll play somehow behind Guirassy, but he didn't seem to start from the beginning that often. Now he is, and he's given some width, and it seems to be working.